Please join me in welcoming Veronique deRugy.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be there, and welcome to everyone who is watching us online. It's great to be here. Bridget and I would go way back, way back, and I love my November talks here. I really appreciate you having me come back, and it's the issue of women in the state is actually, I think, an interesting issue for me because as an economist and conservative libertarian, I tend to just stay away from talking about women's specific issues. I actually think that gender neutral policies are better, that we should, do just sound economics, that targeted policies, whether they're for women or for minorities or for small businesses or green energies are actually very distortive. And so when you guys asked me to talk about this, I was kind of like, it forced me to do something I'm not necessarily comfortable. That being said, as you said, Michelle, as a mother of two teenagers and obviously a woman myself, I realized that I really stand on the shoulder of giants, and most of them women who have actually really fought really hard because there was a time where there was a real need to fight for basic, equality for women, and we have come a long way. And denying that fact is one of the things that usually sets me apart from a lot of women who call themselves feminist. And it doesn't mean I'm not a feminist. I'm absolutely a feminist, but this is where often I disagree, which is, yes, there still is a long way to go, but we have come a long way. Just using my own example, I can't ignore, whether people approve of my choice, I often, personal choice, don't approve of some of the choices I've made, but when you think about the ability of someone like me to decide to pick up and leave my own country, get a job, again in a foreign country, get married, have children, get divorced, and not fall into shame and poverty. This is a tremendous advancement for the ability of women to choose, a productive life and the life that they want. It doesn't mean that every productive life means working. Women today have this luxury often, or at least when they don't have the luxury of working, it's not because, or when they don't have the luxury of staying at home, it's not because they are forced to stay at home. And this is pretty phenomenal. And as women, we should always remember how lucky we are to live at this time, as opposed to, and I'm not obviously a unique case. And I'll go further. 3 years ago, the father of my children passed away. It is a statement to the world we live in that I could still stand on my feet thanks to a job I have, take care of myself, own a home, and be independent, get a tremendous support from my community. Being a woman, being single, having children, working is not a source of discrimination anymore. There's still issues, and we can talk about them during the Q&A. That being said, there are problems. We can address questions of active discrimination that do happen. No one is perfect, and I think human nature means that there will always be people we can point out to say, wow, these guys are real jerks, and hope for the betterment of these people. But what's interesting about is like old-fashioned discrimination or against women used to actually be very blatant. It's like you couldn't work, right? You were not allowed to own property. You didn't have women in combat, right? There were specifically things that women were banned of, even though I have friends who tell me that they actually love having women in combat, better us than them, but, that's some men. Today, the discrimination, or actually the impediment of the state against women, actually presents itself in a very gender neutral fashion. and yet tends to fall disproportionately on women. And I want to name a few, and then after that, I want to give a warning about some of the areas where I think conservatives are sliding that actually are dangerous for women and improving women's freedom and the march towards, whomever and whatever we want to be. So some of these areas where I think women have, I'm going to give you a few, and where we could use some more help. So the convergence between men and women in education, in life choices, in professional choices has been one of the greatest achievements, I think, of the last decades. But one of the things that is sure is that for women who've decided to enter the workforce, it means that activities that, for better or worse, still disproportionately fall onto women to do, like house cleaning. I understand it's changing, but house cleaning and caring for children, is actually had to take a step back. For these women, and for a lot of women, whatever your situation, whether it's because you want to work more or just simply enter the labor force, restrictive immigration policies against low-skill immigrants is an impediment. It means that more access to low-skill immigrants will actually help women, because you find low-skill immigrants in mostly 3 areas: caring for children, house cleaning, and construction. And 2 of them are heavily, or yard work. And 2 of these are like really heavily an area that could very much help women. And you see it in the academic literature, where allowing more low-skill immigration has helped everyone, but it has, and low-income American, there's a small sliver of category, but has actually helped lower income Americans get better job, move up the ladder, because a lot of the things, it freed a lot of their time to do other things at a cheaper price. So restrictive immigration policies is one of the areas where actually is still holding us back. Another area that I think we never think really about is tariffs. So we know that tariffs is a tax on consumption on goods that we import from foreigners. This is often a flat type of tax. It's a regressive tax, and we know, it's no surprise, it hurts lower-income Americans the most. What we don't necessarily think about is how much it affects women. So 75% of the burden of tariffs fall on apparels. Well, 66% of the burden of that particular category fall on women apparel, right? That's almost $3 billion a year falling on products that are exclusively consumed by women, right? That's an 11% price gap between men and women. There's an easy fix to this. We know, economists know and understand, that the economic benefit of free trade is fundamentally a unilateral case. What it means is that the country would benefit, everyone would benefit if we lowered and get rid of tariffs, all forms of trade barriers, and that's the kicker, independently of what other countries are doing. For better or worse, the way we've improved and augmented free trade in the last decades, right, is by having this multinational agreements, right? And they're great, but what they imply is basically we'll lower our tariffs if you lower yours. And we've actually tend to forgotten that actually really the case for tariffs is one where it doesn't matter what you guys are doing. Our country will win if we lower our tariffs. So that's an easy fix. Well, it's an easy fix on paper. Politically, it's not an easy fix, but it's worth considering. Tariffs are hurting women more than they're hurting men. And Another one that may be controversial for conservatives, the war on drug is extremely punishing for women. We've seen the incarceration rate for women skyrocket since the 80s. And these rates have also increased as the system has started targeting more and more the people living with drug dealers. It's basically punishment by association if you don't. Also punishing, having mandatory sentencing for minor offenses. And you see a lot of women, there are much fewer women in jail as a total number than men. It's still the case, but as a share of women in jail, the women in jail for drug offenses is significantly higher than men. What does this mean? And again, you can be in favor of ending the war on drugs, or at least on pot. You know, I mean, I'm not asking everyone to be a radical libertarian, and it doesn't mean you condone the behavior of people who consume drugs. You know, you can actually look at the legal implication of a policy that is sending a massive number of people in jail. What does it mean when we send all these people in jail? And I like to point out that a lot, especially when it comes to marijuana, it's like victimless crimes. So it's like not to be compared with, you know, killing someone. What does it mean for the families? Well, if you send the men in jail, it means a lot of women without husbands. For the children, definitely a lot of children without fathers. When you send both parents, which often happens, you end up with children without parents. This is something that is really important to consider. No matter what your objection to the substance is, it is always worth dissociating both sides of these issues and thinking about the impact it has on women, and it definitely has. There's another aspect of, you know, anything that sends people to jail. And again, I'm not saying you commit a crime, you shouldn't go to jail. The question is, what is it we label a crime? It's like what it means for the family life and for earning abilities when you re-enter the workforce. And often it means massive loss of income going forward for the women, lower wages, and a lot of things. I'll move on to a less controversial topic, regulations. There are a lot of, so women take care of children, take care of sick parents. It's still culturally, that's what we do. We do it more. Again, it's not that things aren't changing or evolving, but I mean, I wouldn't trade my place with anyone. You know, I'm happy that that burden has fallen on me the most. But it is a fact, and it means that we need more flexibility. We want more flexibility, and a lot of regulation in the labor place that make the ability to get in and out of the workforce or have different work arrangement, these regulations that makes it harder, obviously hinder women's ability to grow. Another important aspect of the regulation of the labor market is occupational licensing, right? That's at the state level. I mean, a third of occupations now require licensing. We can have a debate about medical licensing or things that people perceive can put people's lives at risk. I'm an extremist, like in most things on these issues, but I will grant you this. However, you would be stunned. I recommend going to the Institute for Justice website and read everything they have done on occupational licensing. And you will be shocked to see how many hours are required to get a license for things that are completely, you know, like there's no way you're hurting anyone. maybe you'll create bad style by, like decorating a house, like designers, hair braiders. I mean, the worst that can happen, and what can happen, really? I mean, yeah. I mean, you get out with your ugly braids and then you wash your hair if you don't like it, right? That's how it works, right? Horse masseuse. The number of requirements. So, for instance, I was looking in Missouri. Missouri requires 1,000 hours at a school of cosmetology, or 3,000 hours in an apprenticeship, a written exam, and a practical exam. These training, that's just for becoming, you don't even have, it's not for cutting hair. It's just for being a cosmetologist, to put makeup on or clean faces or whatever it is. Rachel Grasler here was saying the other day, we were on a panel together, she was talking about how the requirements for daycare, if you want to above a certain number of kids, the requirements are such that is a complete disincentive for women who could actually stay home, take care of their kids, and have supplemental income by taking care of other kids, because obviously they have a preference and they're good at this. The requirements are insane, but it also makes the price of childcare really expensive for those women who want to join the labor force or want to stay in the labor force or want to actually increase their hours at work. I mean, she was talking about the fact that in Maryland, where she lives, I think, you have to have an emergency car with car seats always ready to go, with all the car seats for the number of kids that you have. It's completely crazy. And it's not just that it dissuades women to do activities that they would want to do, but it also, the end result is either you get fewer childcare professionals available, or it raises cost, or for those who are still there and willing to foot the bill, I mean, the costs are going up, which is also hurting women. So this is something worth thinking about. The other thing that's interesting is when you go and look at occupational licenses, and you see that actually it's almost 30% of the profession that are women-specific that requires licensing, while it's only 23% for men-specific occupation. Right? I mean, women are often, in professions that are, not necessarily. I'm sure there's like professions like nursing and a bunch of others, but it's. I can't imagine that this is dictated by the fact that there are more lives at risks with women being in the job. I could go on and on and on with all these examples. There's one good thing, by the way. It's like last time I gave this talk, I talked about how there was a marriage penalty, because the way the tax code was structured meant that basically if a woman married a man who made significantly more than her, if they were going to file jointly, then they were going to, basically her lower income was going to be taxed at a higher marginal tax rate. So this has been actually changed with the new tax law. The other thing is that women are very entrepreneurial, and they're the head of a lot of small businesses, and a lot of them reported their income, their business income, on as personal income, and with high marginal tax rates. This was a real penalty for women entrepreneurship. Well, that also has been changed for the best. Some people say the adjustment was too much and it's going to lead to a lot of abuses. And so I suspect there's going to be some readjustments there. So there's some real improvement on that front. That said, it is clear that high marginal rates and marginal tax rates have been reduced, but in my opinion, not enough. But again, I also think that as long as we're not going to shrink the size of government, I'm very resistant to cutting taxes on the individual side, because we can't continue kicking the can down the road to our children. But the truth of the matter is, like, the marginal tax rates being high, while in the short run has not that much effect on the supply of labor, right? It's not, if taxes go up, you're not going to change your behavior immediately in your supply, because most of us are in jobs where we can't, right? You can't start suddenly, avoiding taxes or change your profession. I mean, some people can, but the vast majority of us can't. What the literature shows is that there are moments, right, at the margin, there are moments in people's lives where these higher rates actually change the behavior of people. It changed the supply of labor. So when you get out of school, or when you're going to go to school, and this is how you see, for instance, that high marginal rate tend to dissuade women in particular, but also men, to go into professions that are going to be really taxed really high. So instead of being a heart surgeon, you decide to be a pediatrician. A lot of women make that choice all the time, right? Now, it's not a bad choice. It's not a bad choice, but it's unfortunate when our professional choices are dictated by the tax code. And we see that women are particularly sensitive to these high marginal rates, right? And you can say, well, it's because we have the luxury to do it, or we have other priorities. Fine. It's still a problem, in my opinion. The tax code shouldn't be a factor in how we decide to live our lives. And this is not being addressed. Another moment is like how soon people retire. So you raise taxes. Again, it may not really have a direct impact on in the moment. That being said, it may actually change the calculation of how long you're going to stay in the workforce and be productive, right? And I, again, want to make sure that when I say be productive by working, it doesn't mean I'm dismissive of other life choices, but that's, one way of being productive. Another thing that's been really interesting has been shown with the literature, because I know that conservatives make the mistake of focusing too much on taxes and not enough on spending. These effects that I talk about how high taxes change the labor supply, they're basically increased by generous benefits. So benefit, when you're going to decide to work or not work, this decision is going to be more acute if there's actually very high benefits to go with it. And so those two together are things to think about. And that leads me to my warning to conservatives. There is a real shift in the way conservatives are talking about issues like paid leave. And there's a call, a real political call that is sustained by some conservative that women should be getting paid leave. We should be supporting more pro-family policies. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous because of what I just mentioned, right? You increase benefits, and that actually kind of has, in conjunction with higher taxes, can have some effect in the life decisions that you make. And that, to me, is a problem. But it also has a problem because the literature very clearly shows that you won't be surprised, there's no free lunch, right? Paid leave policy tend to backfire against the beneficiaries. And Europe has been really, obviously, a great place to look for the impact of paid leave policy on women, but we also can see it in the US, because there is this idea that the US, if you use a BLS number, that says that there's only 15% of employers or women are benefiting from paid leave. The reality is actually much, this number is much, much bigger, because it ignores that a lot of women are actually getting paid leave through temporary disability insurance, that there's also a lot of different ways that women get paid leave. And there's an excellent report at Cato by Vanessa Brown-Calder that actually looks at all these issues. And one of the things that comes out of the literature is that the real number, and by the way, Rachel here at Heritage has done also some tremendous work. It's like the number for women getting paid leave in the US is anywhere between 45% and 63%, which is very radically different than this 15%. And you'll say, well, what about the others? Should the government provide paid leave? And there's an increased call by conservatives that this is an area where conservatives should be supportive of government action. We know these backfire. Whether the government is paying for it or your employer is paying for it, whether your employers the way it usually evolves is that basically your employer is mandated to give paid leave policy, and the government ends up paying for it. And people think, well, if it's just a question of time, no biggie. Well, actually, it is a problem, because the opportunity cost to an employer is not just the money that it pays you, but it's also the time where you're not there. And we've seen very clearly the result is more discrimination towards women, and a marginal reluctance to hire women of childbearing age, and also lower wages. Again, there's no free lunch. So some conservatives have been saying, we totally understand this. We don't want to go the mandate route. How about we use Social Security benefits? I've written extensively about this, and Rachel has, and so has Vanessa. And it's a terrible idea for a variety of reasons, but I will give you one of my reasons, is that even though it's sold as a revenue spending neutral policy, on paper, this is going to, first, it increases the scope of government, right? This is an area where the government wasn't involved, and now it's going to be involved. And over time, because the pressure for government to actually extend these benefits to a bunch of different things, and to actually, because the way it would work is you would take the benefits now and you would pay it, you would retire later, right? Right. Who believes that government is ever going to be extracting that payment? It's like when you tell your children, dessert now, spinach later. No, it's not going to happen. So what's going to happen with political pressure, you're going to end up with not only an increase in the scope of government, but in the size of government. Again, I don't have enough time to talk about this, but we can talk about it during the Q&A, and I've written extensively about this with Jason Fichter and Charles Blahouse. We have a paper specifically on looking at this issue, and again, just, I guess, I don't know, we can send you links if you ask. To others have done a lot of good research. But it's interesting to see that this proposal for using Social Security as a way to provide paid leave comes because conservatives do have an understanding that mandate and government intervention often backfire and create distortions in the labor market. So that's that. But this is not an appropriate way to do it. Not to mention that it's another also great thing. It's like we went from 16% of women who really in the 60s reported getting benefits to, depending on how you measure it, 63%. And the number, by the way, ends at 2008. And if you remember, in the last year, the number of big companies who've actually come out saying that they were going to expand their paid leave policy, or they were going to provide paid leave, there was a lot of companies talking about this. And it makes sense. When the economy is growing, you want to keep your good employees, and women, they rock. So that's one thing to consider. The other issue I want to talk to you about, and it's not because it's one where I think conservative women are at risk of falling for it, but sometimes you will find yourself in a debate with Democrats or even independent who will say, what about the pay gap? There's a pay gap, right? You hear it all the time. You're like, the paid gap. It's like women are paid, it depends, they go like 79 cents on the dollar when men are paid the whole dollar. It's discrimination. So then whether the question of the paid gap. So that number, so I think now it's like 81 cents on the dollar. And by the way, it used to be way lower than this. It used to be 50 cents on the dollar. So things have improved, even when you look at this measure. This measure, it's a real number. Saying that it's a fake number is not true. It's like you take all the women who work full-time and their median salary, and you divide those numbers, and you do the same for the men, and this is what you find. So it's a real number. The problem with it is that it actually doesn't control for a lot of things. It's comparing orange and apples, or what is it, Venus and Mars, and so it's just not an informative factor. So when you control for education, for professions, for a whole lot of things, you see that gap just shrink quite dramatically. There's still a gap. So then the question is like, what's this gap? What is it for? Is it because of discrimination against women? And there I will recommend, write it down. You must listen. If you want to just get it and in an easy way, I would listen the podcast, the Freakonomics podcast, with Harvard economist Claudia Godwin. She's hardly a raging libertarian, by the way. She's a labor economist, a historian, labor economist. And what her research has found is that actually, when you actually control for other things and look at what this gap is, while there are some areas or some cases where you could point out that there's discrimination, it's not that. It's what she's called women's desire for temporal flexibility. And it falls and it goes back to what is temporal flexibility? Is that, again, culturally, biologically, whatever it is, women tend to be caregivers of our children, of our parents, of our siblings, of whomever, of the world. And that means that we would prefer having employments that actually allow us more flexibility, right? And if you control for that, then basically you've explained pretty much all of the gap. When you control for education and and profession and all that stuff and temporal flexibility, so you explain most of the gap. It doesn't mean, again, that there aren't cases of discrimination. But as she said, the smoking gun is really hard to find. It's like it used to be easy to find, but it's not. No women hired. The same can be said about minorities. And this is one of the great things. Now, Democrats tend to say, oh, this is a mommy tax, right? I call it a choice. It's actually a choice. It's a choice that women make. Maybe it's a choice that is, I don't know, I'm not, this is not my area of expertise, but maybe it's driven by who we are. Maybe it's driven by our biology. I don't know, and I don't care. What I care about is that women have the choice. And in a world where we have the internet, where we have Uber, who can drive your children around, even though it may not be legal, it's like our lives as women have improved tremendously. We can do a more and more and better job and see even our professional lives converge more and more and more with men thanks to these new techniques. But the reality is, like, as long as we will be those caretakers, we will be making some choices that have a price to us. You can call it a tax, But what it means is that because of what causes that gap, it's actually, you can't fix it through government mandate and government policy. It's much harder. You will require cultural changes, for better or worse. It will require a whole lot of things. I am actually, again, as I said, I'm a proponent that a lot of these choices that women have to make now will be made moot by technological advancements. Again, for better or worse. I mean, there's no, everything has a price, but it's really worth kind of remembering these arguments when we talk to people, concerned people who said, what about the pay gap? And listen to that podcast. It's really great. Read everything by Claudia Golden. It's great. It's really interesting because she comes at it, I think, from a more liberal sensitivity, and so it's really interesting. And so but my warning to conservative women is, in that quest for, better family policies, and we should never forget that government involvement is never free. It always creates distortions. They may never be, some of them may not be visible. It's just Jonathan Gruber, the Obamacare guy, he's done work showing that, because in the US, states that actually 5 states really implement really comprehensive paid leave policies. And what he's found, his research has found that basically women in these states, their wages have gone down. Not quite dramatically, but they've gone down. Just the other thing that's kind of interesting is when you look at basically with paid gap, and is as it relates to age. There are moments where the pay gap doesn't exist, right out of college and when you're out of childbearing age. So it gives you things to think about. And I'll end on this and say, sure, there's always things we could do better. There are always things, but we ultimately always have to remember that we should be unbelievably grateful to be women in 2018. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Great. We have a mic. Yes. If you raise your hand, if you give your affiliation, your name and your affiliation, and I'll let you call on people. Okay.
Danny.
Hi, Danny Dunn with the Heritage Foundation. I'm so glad you brought up occupational licensing. It really makes me angry because I was reading about how in DC, I think they're requiring daycare providers to have all these degrees now. And it's horrible what they're doing to not only the people who need these jobs, but also the people who benefit from having people in these positions. One of the things I was wondering about is, have you seen any indication from any kind of left side perspective of this? It seems to me that this is something that should cut across the partisan barriers.
It absolutely cuts across. This is actually something where I think we're going to make a lot of progress at some point. If you remember, there was one of President Obama's budget that actually, there's nothing really that the federal government can do, but what he was talking about, what his budget was talking about, it was this was a real concern. And because what it does is what licensing is for is to basically prevent competition. So what it does is it's basically cronyism. It's a way to protect the people who are already in the industry from competition from newcomers who would be offering, either better products or lower price or both, right? And it does basically raises the prices for consumers inside these protected jobs. And so there's a lot of, I think, understanding on the right and on the left that this hurts newcomers and low-income people. And again, women, it definitely hurts women, because on the childcare one, it not only hurts women who want to have access to childcare provision, but also it helps the suppliers of childcare. So I think it is moving. This is an area where definitely at Mercatus we've done a lot of work on occupational licensing. There are a lot of support on the left for this. Incidentally, a lot of support on the left and on the right. This is actually, I should be fair to Republicans and conservatives on criminal justice reform. We're moving in the right direction because I think there's just a clear understanding that a lot of these policies, even though they may not have, as I said, it's like discrimination against Black and minorities or against women. I mean, they may not be openly discriminatory. They may be totally race neutral and gender neutral, but the result, the ultimate impact of the policy is that they hurt minorities, Black and women a great deal.
Sharon Bovat. I'm voice of a moderate, becoming voice of a libertarian. Recently, Chelsea,
we'll have you.
Thank you. Chelsea Clinton was talking about the tampon tax, and so I researched it. And yes, there is a tax on tampons in many states. And yes, I guess Medicaid or some of the affiliate Viagra is for free. So there is some discrimination when it comes to certain areas with women, which is obvious. And also, when you were talking about the where the caregivers, I work for myself. The Obamacare has destroyed my life. I make about $70,000 a year. My health insurance is about $20,000 after taxes. I've looked into moving to Costa Rica. I do not think the Republican Party, the conservatives, and the libertarians have done a good job to explain to the average person how horrible it is for people that want to work. I've been told to not work. If I quit working and I basically funnel money certain ways, I can get free health care, but that's not part of me. That's not part of my DNA. So if you can just talk about Obamacare and how we as conservatives, libertarians can address this, I think it'll make a big difference. Thank you.
First I'll address your tampon tax. So this is like a big thing right now. It seems my daughters have alerted me, and yes, this is the problem with taxation, right? Is that it's discriminatory. Especially sales taxes, when you look at, there's no rhyme or reasons for why. I mean, some of it, there's interest group, you can track them, but there's also no rhyme or reason. And I won't give you a good example because I can't forget it, but during the Supreme Court case, the Wayfair, there were a lot of examples of like, if you buy diapers for a gift, it's taxed, or a blanket for a hospital, it's taxed, but if you buy it for can't remember what, it's not taxed. There's all these there's all these differences. It's like it's crazy. It's crazy. And I think everything should be taxed at the same rate or not taxed at all. But it's the fact that we're gonna get rid of the tax on Tampax in order to address the lack of tax on Viagra is two wrongs don't make a right. So I think this is a real problem, and this is also a tendency that women have, is to say, oh, they get this privilege from the government, why don't we get that same one? When actually the answer is like, there should be no discrimination between one thing or another. And that's that. On Obamacare, I mean, this is a longer question. I actually think you're right that a lot of people don't understand what's going on. And I think a lot of people are also scared. The truth of the matter is, like, the cost of healthcare is really, really high. But what people don't understand is the reason why the cost of healthcare is so high, right? Some of it is you're getting higher quality care than you did, but a big chunk of this is actually that there's government intervention that jacks up the price. And I think conservatives and libertarians, the free market movement has made a mistake from the get-go in focusing on trying to address the demand by Democrats that we needed to fight for a free market provision of insurance, right? The insurance. But whether the government pays for your health care, so the federal government, or it's the state government, which is often a conservative position, we say, let's move it all to the states. Or an insurance, what it is, it's the third party is paying for your health care decisions. And this is not sustainable. It's unsustainable. Now, moral hazard and distortions are less with insurance when it's a private party, but they still exist. I mean, think about this. 11% only of the money we spend on healthcare is out of pocket. It means that basically, for the most part, someone else is paying for your healthcare. And the problem is, like, we have banged our head for decades trying to find a solution without a problem without a solution, basically, to try to address a problem without a solution. It's like, you're not going to get a free market system if your solution is how do we find someone, how do we make it possible for someone else to pay your bill without distortions? So what we do at the Mercatus Center now is, like, we're done talking about this. I mean, I talked sometimes about the problem caused by third-party payers, because I think this is something that people fail to understand. And what we do instead is what we want to free the supply of healthcare. The supply of healthcare, like when you look at areas that are heavily regulated, energy, education, and healthcare, right? They're all areas where there's massive government intervention. And it's not just government intervention. It's very often it's like we talked about with occupational licensing, it's like interest groups trying to actually demand more regulations to prevent competition. And all of this explains why we haven't seen the kind of innovation and the kind of reduction in prices for things that we consume in healthcare that we've seen in other systems. Think about it. When the free market movement started talking about how to allow private insurance to compete more, I mean, there weren't even any cell phone. In the meantime, we've made almost no progress on that front. And I'm carrying a massively powerful computer in my pockets all the time. We want to do this with healthcare. That means freeing healthcare suppliers, tying the hands of interest groups. Again, easy on paper and all this, but it's inspirational. We should be able to actually use telemarketers. We should be able to have our x-rays read by a doctor in Australia when it's daytime here. There's so much we should be able to do. Right to work, right to try is important. Deregulation of the FDA is important. There's so much we can do. And I'm telling you, my colleague Bob Grayboys, when he gives a talk, people come out and they're excited. And Adam Thier at Mercatus, go check out their work. It's inspirational, and it's the right direction about healthcare. This is a fight worth fighting, right? It's not going to solve your problem right now. The battle of ideas takes a long time. But I actually believe that the government is always abusing its power, and the more and more insurance is unaffordable, the more people are going to actually go outside of the insurance system, and more doctors are going to say, you know what, I'm going to serve that population. And look, you see it. I mean, I don't have numbers, and I really want someone to do a study on this, but low-skilled immigrants in the country, they don't get their health care a lot. I mean, contrary to a lot of what you hear, sure, they go to emergency rooms, but they get a lot of their doctors through their Bolivian network, this is not an insurance system, right? And it's not just immigrants. There's just a lot of, and I can guarantee you millennials who are used to doing Amazon Prime at 3 o'clock in the morning and getting it on their doorstep at 7 in the morning, believe me, this is how it works, because I do it. I try to pass myself for a millennial. It's only works with Amazon. But they're not going to tolerate standing in line for government healthcare provided. They're going to say, screw this. There must be an app for that. And there will be an app for this. It's going to take time. It's going to take some adjustments. They're going to be, but we need to let entrepreneurs try. And unfortunately, the FDA has a very precautionary mind as opposed to allowing permissionless innovation. But I think there's a moment where they're going to be overwhelmed by what's happening.
I wanted to ask you one more question, if I may, and then we can talk informally if you all have questions. I'd love to hear you talk about Social Security, what a deal it is for women.
Yeah.
Remind us.
Yeah, no, it's well, it's a deal for no one. I mean, but women may be the only one to get a little bit. Married women get a little bit out of the system, but for everyone else, single women, single men, minorities, young people, it's a massive redistribution of wealth from these groups to married people, white people, and old people, obviously, right? And the problem is, like, it's really not a bargain. Even the people who get the money, they pay way more into the system than they actually get in the end. It's a terrible return on investment. But it is like my real problem with, even with my colleagues, some of my colleagues that I love and adore, when we talk about solvency, I said, to me, Social Security is not just a financial problem, even though it is. It is an unfair system. It really is. It redistributes, and because, like when in 1935, when the system was put in place or so, it is true that when you were old and you stopped working, you were poor. There were no financial markets. It's not the case. I mean, seniors today are overrepresented in the top income quintile, right? And yet we have the system that transfers massive amount of wealth to them. And they are, by the way, they're better off because of the market, because of capital markets, because the net wealth have increased so tremendously, and it's a great thing, right? But it's really not a good deal for anyone. And even if you're a woman, by the way, even for these women who still may get a bit more into it from the system that they pay in, they have children, and they are taxed, and they are transferring all that money to other people. So what I'd like to see actually is Medicaid is a different situation, but I would like to move away from an age-based entitlement programs, even though, by the way, it's not an entitlement, and transition to a needs-based. I think this is it would make much more sense. But anyway.
Thank you so much. What a good talk. Really appreciate it. I'm going to give you our special little mug here with the famous saying. What is that?
No good deed goes unpunished.
There you go. This is loose. That's Claire Booth Loose.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And from Heritage, too, we have a gift in this wintry weather here, a Heritage scarf. I find Veronique's comments always so provocative and so interesting.
Oh, thank you.
And I think she gives us really a lot of things to think about. A dynamic market is really an innovative place that helps to serve the needs of families and women particularly. I think as women are juggling, I think the occupational licensing points that she made, regulation, I think stymies the innovation that more often than not simplifies our life. You're up at 3 o'clock in the morning ordering Amazon Prime thanks to an incredible technological device.
Well, I'll say that the reason why I was up is because I got a text in the middle of the night from my daughter who was at a sleepover and was kicked out of the mattress where she was. And she was like, "You still up?" And I was like, "Well, now I'm not." So it goes both ways.
Still to serve the needs of your children and your family at 3 o'clock in the morning. So thank you so much for joining us, and we invite you all to join us for lunch outside where we can continue the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Yes.
I love this.
Yes.
I wear mine. You gave me one.